The role of Roman Catholic Church and Church of England played in African slavery. They preached salvation while blessing slavery. Two of the world's most powerful churches, the Roman Catholic Church and the Church of England, didn't just witness the African slave trade, they profited from it. This is the story they don't teach in Sunday school. They called it God's will, but it was man's greed. For centuries, the Roman Catholic Church and the Church of England stood at the heart of one of history's darkest trades. This is the side of church history you were never meant to hear. What if I told you? The same hands that blessed you on Sunday once branded people like cattle. The Roman Catholic Church and the Church of England didn't just pray over slavery, they helped build it. Imagine kneeling in prayer, while the very church you worshipped owned you. For millions of Africans, this wasn't imagination, it was reality. This is the untold truth about the Roman Catholic Church, the Church of England, and the slave trade. 1452, the Pope blesses slavery. 1700s, the Church of England brands humans with its initials. 1807, the tide turns. This is the explosive story of faith, power, and chains. Faith and chains, how the churches shaped African slavery. For centuries, ships crossed the oceans, carrying not just goods, but human souls torn from their homes. At the heart of this tragic trade lay not only kings, merchants, and soldiers, but also the most unexpected of institutions, the church. From the late 15th century, the transatlantic slave trade became one of the largest forced migrations in history. Millions of Africans were captured, sold, and transported to work in plantations across the Americas and the Caribbean. But behind the sails and shackles, religion, specifically the Roman Catholic Church and the Church of England, played both a blessing and a curse. The Roman Catholic Church's role. The Roman Catholic Church during the Age of Discovery was deeply entwined with Portuguese and Spanish empires. In 1452, Pope Nicholas V issued a papal bull, Dum Diversas, granting Christian rulers the right to enslave non-Christians in newly discovered lands. Later bulls like Romanus Pontifex reinforced this idea, blessing the expansion of European powers into Africa. Missionaries sailed alongside conquistadors. Some genuinely sought to convert and protect Africans, but often this protection came only after enslavement. In many colonies, Catholic priests baptized enslaved Africans, preaching obedience as a Christian duty, while the trade itself continued largely unchallenged, seeds of resistance in Catholicism. Yet, not all within the Catholic Church agreed. Figures like Bartolomé de las Casas in the 16th century spoke out, condemning the cruelty of Spanish colonists. Later, in the 19th century, the Vatican began to officially denounce slavery. But by then, the damage had been done and millions had perished or been displaced. The Church of England's involvement. The Church of England, born from the English Reformation, also became deeply involved in the slave trade. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the Anglican Church's missionary arm, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, owned plantations in Barbados worked by enslaved Africans. Shockingly, branding irons with the letters SPG marked the bodies of enslaved people to show church ownership. Sermons often told slaves that earthly suffering was part of God's plan, promising reward in the afterlife rather than freedom on earth. Anglican abolitionists. Yet, just as in Catholicism, not all Anglicans supported the trade. Evangelicals within the Church of England, like William Wilberforce, led the charge in Britain's abolition movement, using biblical arguments to demand the end of the slave trade. In 1807, Britain finally outlawed the trade, followed by full emancipation in the 1830s. Legacy and reckoning. Today, both the Roman Catholic Church and the Church of England have made public apologies for their roles in slavery. Yet the wounds run deep in the diaspora, in African economies, and in the cultural memory of millions. Faith was used as a chain, but also eventually as a key. The story of these churches in African slavery is a story of power, contradiction, and the long, painful road from complicity to repentance. History's greatest tragedies often hide in plain sight. To understand the present, we must confront the past, even when that past wears holy robes. What do you think? Can faith institutions ever fully atone for slavery? Leave your thoughts in the comments. The churches and the slave trade, a dark history. Two powerful churches, one of humanity's darkest crimes. The Roman Catholic Church and the Church of England both played a role in the African slave trade. In the 1400s, the Pope gave European rulers the green light to enslave non-Christians. Papal bulls like Dum Diversas and Romanus Pontifex blessed the Portuguese and Spanish empires as they raided Africa. Priests baptized enslaved Africans, preaching obedience, while the trade thrived. A few, like Bartolomé de las Casas, spoke out, but official condemnation came centuries too late. The Anglican entanglement. The Church of England owned plantations in the Caribbean. Enslaved people were literally branded with the letters SPG, the mark of a church missionary society. Some clergy told slaves their suffering was God's plan, but others, like William Wilberforce, fought to end the trade, helping pass Britain's abolition law in 1807. Both churches have since apologized, but the scars remain in the diaspora, in Africa's history, in the collective memory of millions. Faith was once used to justify chains, but also eventually to break them. History's not just in books, it's in the choices we make today. Faith and chains. Two powerful churches, one of history's darkest crimes. The Roman Catholic Church and the Church of England. Catholic Church's role. In the 1400s, the Pope's decree gave empires the right to enslave non-Christians. Documents like Dum Diversas and Romanus Pontifex blessed the raids on Africa. In the 1400s, the Pope's decree gave empires the right to enslave non-Christians. Documents like Dum Diversas and Romanus Pontifex blessed the raids on Africa. 1452. Papal bull authorizes slavery. Africa targeted for conversion. Priests baptized the enslaved, preaching obedience, while the trade thrived. Church of England's role. The Church of England owned Caribbean plantations. Enslaved people were branded SPG, the mark of a missionary society. Owned by the Church, suffering as God's plan, seeds of change. But not all obeyed. Anglican reformers like William Wilberforce fought to end the trade and won abolition in 1807. Legacy. Today, both churches have apologized, but the scars remain in Africa's history and in the lives shaped by that past. Faith once justified chains, but also, eventually, broke them. History's not just in books, it's in the choices we make today. Subscribe for Untold History. Faith and Chains, the Churches and the Slave Trade. Two churches, one of humanity's darkest crimes. In 1452, Pope Nicholas V issued a decree giving Christian rulers the right to enslave non-Christians. More decrees followed, blessing the Portuguese and Spanish conquests in Africa. 1452. Papal bull authorizes slavery. The Church of England also profited. Its missionary arm, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, owned plantations. Enslaved people were branded with the church's initials. Africa targeted for conversion. Priests baptized the enslaved, preaching obedience, while the trade thrived. Slavery has historically been widespread in Africa. Systems of servitude and slavery were once commonplace in parts of Africa, as they were in much of the rest of the ancient and medieval world. When the trans-Saharan slave trade, Red Sea slave trade, Indian Ocean slave trade, and Atlantic slave trade, which started in the 16th century, began, many of the pre-existing local African slave systems began supplying captives for slave markets outside Africa. Slavery in contemporary Africa still exists in some regions despite being illegal. Africa is the world's second largest and second most populous continent after Asia. At about 30.3 million kilometers 2, 11.7 million square miles, including adjacent islands, it covers 20% of Earth's land area and 6% of its total surface area. With nearly 1.4 billion people as of 2021, it accounts for about 18% of the world's human population. Africa's population is the youngest among all the continents. The median age in 2012 was 19.7, when the worldwide median age was 30.4. Based on 2024 projections, Africa's population will exceed 3.8 billion people by 2100. Africa is the least wealthy inhabited continent per capita and second least wealthy by total wealth, ahead of Oceania. Scholars have attributed this to different factors, including geography, climate, corruption, colonialism, the Cold War, and neo-colonialism. Despite this low concentration of wealth, recent economic expansion and a large and young population make Africa an important economic market in the broader global context, and Africa has a large quantity of natural resources. Africa straddles the equator and the prime meridian. The continent is surrounded by the Mediterranean Sea to the north, the Arabian Plate, and the Gulf of Aqaba to the northeast, the Indian Ocean to the southeast, and the Atlantic Ocean to the west. France, Italy, Portugal, Spain, and Yemen have parts of their territories located on African geographical soil, mostly in the form of islands. The continent includes Madagascar and various archipelagos. It contains 54 fully recognized sovereign states, 8 cities and islands that are part of non-African states, and 2 de facto independent states with limited or no recognition. This count does not include Malta and Sicily, which are geologically part of the African continent. Algeria is Africa's largest country by area, and Nigeria is its largest by population. African nations cooperate through the establishment of the African Union, which is headquartered in Addis Ababa. Africa is highly biodiverse. It is the continent with the largest number of megafauna species, as it was least affected by the extinction of the Pleistocene megafauna. However, Africa is also heavily affected by a wide range of environmental issues, including desertification, deforestation, water scarcity, and pollution. These entrenched environmental concerns are expected to worsen as climate change impacts Africa. The UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has identified Africa as the continent most vulnerable to climate change. The history of Africa is long, complex, and varied, and has often been underappreciated by the global historical community. In African societies, the oral word is revered, and they have generally recorded their history via oral tradition, which has led anthropologists to term them oral civilizations, contrasted with literate civilizations, which pride the written word. African culture is rich and diverse both within and between the continent's regions, encompassing art, cuisine, music and dance, religion, and dress. In the relevant literature, African slavery is categorized into indigenous slavery and export slavery, depending on whether or not slaves were traded beyond the continent. Slavery in historical Africa was practiced in many different forms. Debt slavery, enslavement of war captives, military slavery, slavery for prostitution, and enslavement of criminals were all practiced in various parts of Africa. Slavery for domestic and court purposes was widespread throughout Africa. Plantation slavery also occurred, primarily on the eastern coast of Africa and in parts of West Africa. The importance of domestic plantation slavery increased during the 19th century. Due to the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade, many African states that were dependent on the international slave trade reoriented their economies towards legitimate commerce worked by slave labor. Slavery is the ownership of a person as property, especially in regards to their labor. It is an economic phenomenon, and its history resides in economic history. Slavery typically involves compulsory work, with the slave's location of work and residence dictated by the party that holds them in bondage. Enslavement is the placement of a person into slavery, and the person is called a slave or an enslaved person. Peter, a slave from Louisiana, in 1863. The scars are the result of a whipping by his overseer. Many historical cases of enslavement occurred as a result of breaking the law. becoming indebted, suffering a military defeat, or exploitation for cheaper labor. Other forms of slavery were instituted along demographic lines such as race or sex. Slaves would be kept in bondage for life or for a fixed period of time after which they would be granted freedom. Although slavery is usually involuntary and involves coercion, there are also cases where people voluntarily enter into slavery to pay a debt or earn money due to poverty. In the course of human history, slavery was a typical feature of civilization and existed in most societies throughout history, but it is now outlawed in most countries of the world, except as a punishment for a crime. In general, there were two types of slavery throughout human history: domestic and productive. In chattel slavery, the slave is legally rendered the personal property, chattel, of the slave owner. In economics, the term de facto slavery describes the conditions of unfree labor and forced labor that most slaves endure. In 2019, approximately 40 million people, of whom 26% were children, were still enslaved throughout the world despite slavery being illegal. In the modern world, more than 50% of slaves provide forced labor, usually in the factories and sweatshops of the private sector of a country's economy. In industrialized countries, human trafficking is a modern variety of slavery. In non-industrialized countries, people in debt bondage are common. Others include captive domestic servants, people in forced marriages, and child soldiers. Different forms of slavery and servitude existed throughout African history and were shaped by indigenous practices of slavery, as well as the Roman institution of slavery, and the later Christian views on slavery, the Islamic institutions of slavery via the Muslim slave trade, and eventually the Atlantic slave trade. Slavery was part of the economic structure of African societies for many centuries, although the extent varied. Ibn Battuta, who visited the ancient kingdom of Mali in the mid-14th century, recounts that the local inhabitants competed with each other in the number of slaves and servants they had, and was himself given a slave boy as a hospitality gift. In sub-Saharan Africa, the slave relationships were often complex, with rights and freedoms denied to individuals held in slavery and restrictions on sale and treatment by their masters. Many communities had hierarchies between different types of slaves, for example, differentiating between those who had been born into slavery and those who had been captured through war. The forms of slavery in Africa were closely related to kinship structures. In many African communities where land could not be owned, enslavement of individuals was used as a means to increase the influence a person had and expand connections. This made slaves a permanent part of a master's lineage, and the children of slaves could become closely connected with the larger family ties. Children of slaves born into families could be integrated into the master's kinship group and rise to prominent positions within society, even to the level of chief in some instances. However, stigma often remained, and there could be strict separations between slave members of a kinship group and those related to the master. Chattel slavery. Chattel slavery is a specific servitude relationship where the slave is treated as the property of the owner. As such, the owner is free to sell, trade, or treat the slave as he would other pieces of property, and the children of the slave often are retained as the property of the master. There is evidence of long histories of chattel slavery in the Nile River Valley, much of the Sahel, and North Africa. Evidence is incomplete about the extent and practices of chattel slavery throughout much of the rest of the continent prior to written records by Arab or European traders. Domestic service. Many slave relationships in Africa revolved around domestic slavery. Slaves would work primarily in the house of the master, but retain some freedoms. Domestic slaves could be considered part of the master's household and would not be sold to others without extreme cause. The slaves could own the profits from their labor, whether in land or in products, and could marry and pass the land on to their children in many cases. Pawnship. Pawnship, in its core definition, refers to the practice of using something or someone as collateral for a loan. This can involve pledging a valuable object, like jewelry or even a person, to secure a loan, with the understanding that the collateral can be forfeited if the loan isn't repaid. Historically, pawnship has been a significant practice in various cultures, particularly in West Africa, where it served as a credit system and a source of labor, though it has also been associated with exploitation and, in some cases, even slavery. Pawnship, or debt bondage slavery, involves the use of people as collateral to secure the repayment of debt. Slave labor is performed by the debtor or a relative of the debtor, usually a child. Pawnship was a common form of collateral in West Africa. It involved the pledge of a person or a member of that person's family to serve another person providing credit. Pawnship was related to, yet distinct from, slavery in most conceptualizations, because the arrangement could include limited specific terms of service to be provided, and because kinship ties would protect the person from being sold into slavery. Pawnship was a common practice throughout West Africa prior to European contact, including among the Akan people, the Yu people, the Ga people, the Yoruba people, and the Edo people. In modified forms, it also existed among the Efik people, the Igbo people, the Ijaw people, and the Fon people. A pledge is a bailment that conveys title to property owned by a debtor, the pledgor, to a creditor, the pledgee, to secure repayment for some debt or obligation, and to the mutual benefit of both parties. The term is also used to denote the property which constitutes the security. The pledge is a type of security interest. Pledge is the pignus of Roman law, from which most of the modern European-based law on the subject is derived, but is generally a feature of even the most basic legal systems. A pledge of personal property is known as a pawn. Military slavery. Military slavery involved the acquisition and training of conscripted military units which would retain the identity of military slaves even after their service. Slave soldier groups would be run by a patron, who could be the head of a government or an independent warlord, and who would send his troops out for money and his own political interests. This was most significant in the Nile Valley, primarily in Sudan and Uganda, with slave military units organized by various Islamic authorities and with the war chiefs of Western Africa. The military units in Sudan were formed in the 1800s through large-scale military raiding in the area, which is currently the countries of Sudan and South Sudan. Slaves for sacrifice. Human sacrifice is the act of killing one or more humans as part of a ritual, which is usually intended to please or appease gods. A human ruler, public or jurisdictional demands for justice by capital punishment, an authoritative priestly figure, spirits of dead ancestors, or as a retainer sacrifice, wherein a monarch's servants are killed in order for them to continue to serve their master in the next life. Closely related practices found in some tribal societies are cannibalism and headhunting. Human sacrifice is also known as ritual murder. Human sacrifice was practiced in many human societies beginning in prehistoric times. By the Iron Age, 1st millennium BCE, with the associated developments in religion, the Axial Age, human sacrifice was becoming less common throughout Africa, Europe, and Asia, and came to be looked down upon as barbaric during classical antiquity. In the Americas, however, human sacrifice continued to be practiced, by some, to varying degrees until the European colonization of the Americas. Today, human sacrifice has become extremely rare. Modern secular laws treat human sacrifices as murder. Most major religions in the modern day condemn the practice. For example, in Hinduism, the Srimad Bhagavatam condemns human sacrifice and cannibalism, warning of severe punishment in the afterlife for those who commit such acts. The annual customs of Dahomey, Xwetanu or Huetanu in Fon, were the main yearly celebration in the kingdom of Dahomey, held at the capital, Abomey. These ceremonies were largely started under King Agaja around 1730 and involved significant collection and distribution of gifts and tribute, religious ceremonies involving human sacrifice, military parades, and discussions by dignitaries about the future for the kingdom. Tradition amongst the Fawn in Western Africa, and among other ethnic groups, often had ceremonies in family lineages where all members of the family would gather for a feast, provide gifts to the eldest member of the family, and discuss issues pertaining to the family. As part of the religious vodun practiced in the area, gifts and sacrifices to the spirits and ancestors would also be given. King Haweg-Badja, c. 1645-1685, changed this widespread practice during his reign by making it so that sacrifices or gifts to spirits would have to be done by the king. King Agaja, 1718-1740, further centralized the ceremonies under the king and the royal dynasty. Under Agaja, the annual customs became the central religious ceremony in the kingdom. Wide participation by most of the population was required. All family lineages were expected to provide gifts and tribute, sometimes considered taxes, to the ruler, and aspects of animal and human sacrifice were added to the practice. The traditional family lineage ceremonies were not allowed in the kingdom until after the royal ceremony was completed. After Agaja, the ceremony grew larger, longer, and more lavish by future kings. Human sacrifice was common in West African states and during the 19th century, although archaeological evidence is not clear on the issue prior to European contact. In those societies that practiced human sacrifice, slaves became the most prominent victims. The annual customs of Dahomey were the most notorious example of human sacrifice of slaves, where 500 prisoners would be sacrificed. Sacrifices were carried out all along the West African coast and further inland. Sacrifices were common in the Benin Empire, in what is now southern Nigeria, and in several small independent states in the same region. In the Ashanti region, human sacrifice was often combined with capital punishment. Local slave trade. Bono State, also known as Bono Man, was the first centralized Akan state, founded by the Bono people in what is now central Ghana. Bono Man is generally considered a cultural, political ancestor and origin to Akan subgroups that migrated southward and eastward during and after its decline in the 18th centuries. The capital centered at Bono Manso, the state flourished in the forest-savanna transition zone and encompassed areas within present-day Bono region, Bono East region, and Ahafo region, as well as parts of eastern Ivory Coast. Bono State was a trading center connecting merchants across Africa. The state's wealth grew substantially through the control of gold production and trade, with material culture such as gold weights, brassworking, and textiles attesting to its urban complexity. The Akan gold trade to the savannah and far beyond had been essential since the opening of Akan gold fields to Jula merchants under Mali and Songhai Empire dating back to at least 15th century. Bego sent gold mined in the Akan gold fields to the north, both Kong and Bobo Dioulasso, from whence the gold was carried to Djenné-Timbuktu corridor and across Sahara. Like most other regions of the world, slavery and forced labor existed in many kingdoms and societies of Africa for hundreds of years. Ugo Kwokegi has called early European reports of slavery throughout Africa in the 1600s unreliable, saying they conflated various forms of servitude with chattel slavery. The best evidence of slave practices in Africa comes from the major kingdoms, particularly along the coast, and there is little evidence of widespread slavery practices in stateless societies. Slave trading was mostly secondary to other trade relationships. However, there is evidence of a trans-Saharan slave trade route from Roman times, which persisted in the area after the fall of the Roman Empire. However, kinship structures and rights provided to slaves, except those captured in war, appears to have limited the scope of slave trading before the start of the trans-Saharan slave trade, Indian Ocean slave trade, and the Atlantic slave trade. North Africa. Slavery in northern Africa dates back to ancient Egypt. The New Kingdom, 1558-1080 BC, brought large numbers of slaves as prisoners of war up the Nile Valley and used them for domestic and supervised labor. Ptolemaic Egypt, 305 BC, 30 BC, used both land and sea routes to bring in slaves. Slavery in northern Africa dates back to ancient Egypt. The New Kingdom, 1558-1080 BC, brought large numbers of slaves as prisoners of war up the Nile Valley and used them for domestic and supervised labor. Ptolemaic Egypt, 305 BC, 30 BC, used both land and sea routes to bring in slaves. Chattel slavery was legal and widespread throughout North Africa, be it under ancient Carthage, circa 814 BC, 146 BC, or later when the region was controlled by the Roman Empire, 145 BC, circa 430 AD, and the Eastern Romans, 533 to 695 AD. A slave trade bringing Saharans through the desert to North Africa, which existed in Roman times, continued, and documentary evidence in the Nile Valley shows it to have been regulated there by treaty. As the Roman Republic expanded, it enslaved defeated enemies, and Roman conquests in Africa were no exception. For example, Orosius records that Rome enslaved 27,000 people from North Africa in 256 BC. Piracy became an important source of slaves for the Roman Empire, and in the 5th century AD pirates would raid coastal North African villages and enslave those captured. Expansion across the Sahara, the practices continued, and eventually, the assimilative form of slavery spread to major societies on the southern end of the Sahara, such as Mali, Songhai, and Ghana. The medieval slave trade in Europe was mainly to the east and south. The Christian Byzantine Empire and the Muslim world were the destinations, and Central and Eastern Europe an important source of slaves. The slave trade in medieval Europe was carried out in parts of Europe by both Christians and Jews. In the early medieval period, Jews had a near monopoly on trade between Islamic and Christian countries, but by the 13th century this no longer applied to the slave trade. The Mamluks were slave soldiers who converted to Islam and served the Muslim caliphs and the Ayyubid sultans during the Middle Ages. The first Mamluks served the Abbasid caliphs in 9th century Baghdad. Over time, they became a powerful military caste, and on more than one occasion they seized power for themselves, for example, ruling Egypt from 1250 to 1517. From 1250 on, Egypt was ruled by the Bahri dynasty of Kipchak Turk origin. White enslaved people from the Caucasus served in the army and formed an elite corps of troops, eventually revolting in Egypt to form the Burgi dynasty. According to Robert Davis, between 1 million and 1.25 million Europeans were captured by Barbary pirates and sold as slaves to North Africa and the Ottoman Empire between the 16th and 19th centuries. However, to extrapolate his numbers, Davis assumes the number of European slaves captured by Barbary pirates were constant for a 250-year period, stating, "There are no records of how many men, women, and children were enslaved, but it is possible to calculate roughly the number of fresh captives that would have been needed to keep populations steady and replace those slaves who died, escaped, were ransomed, or converted to Islam. On this basis, it is thought that around 8,500 new slaves were needed annually to replenish numbers, about 850,000 captives over the century from 1580 to 1680. By extension, for the 250 years between 1530 and 1780, the figure could easily have been as high as 1,150,000. Davis's numbers have been disputed by other historians, such as David Earle, who cautions that the true picture of European slaves is clouded by the fact the corsairs also seized non-Christian whites from Eastern Europe and black people from West Africa. In addition, the number of slaves traded was hyperactive, with exaggerated estimates relying on peak years to calculate averages for entire centuries, or millennia. Hence, there were wide fluctuations year to year, particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries, given slave imports, and also given the fact that, prior to the 1840s, there are no consistent records. Middle East expert John Wright cautions that modern estimates are based on back calculations from human observation. Such observations across the late 1500s and early 1600s observers estimate that around 35,000 European Christian slaves held throughout this period on the Barbary coast, across Tripoli, Tunis, but mostly in Algiers. The majority were sailors taken with their ships, but others were fishermen and coastal villagers, and overall most of the captives were people from lands close to Africa, particularly Spain and Italy. The coastal villages and towns of Italy, Portugal, Spain, and Mediterranean islands were frequently attacked by the pirates, and long stretches of the Italian and Spanish coasts were almost completely abandoned by their inhabitants. After 1600, Barbary pirates occasionally entered the Atlantic and struck as far north as Iceland. The most famous corsairs were the Ottoman Barbarossa, Redbeard, and his older brother Oruç, Turgut Reis, known as Dragut in the west, Kurtolu, known as Kurtogoli in the west, Kemal Reis, Salih Reis, and Kokamurat Reis. In 1544, Hayreddin Barbarossa captured Ischia, taking 4,000 prisoners in the process, and deported to slavery some 9,000 inhabitants of Lipari, almost the entire population. In 1551, Dragut enslaved the entire population of the Maltese island Gozo, between 5,000 and 6,000, sending them to Libya. When pirates sacked Vieste in southern Italy in 1554, they took an estimated 7,000 slaves. In 1555, Turgut Reis sailed to Corsica and ransacked Bastia, taking 6,000 prisoners. In 1558, Barbary corsairs captured the town of Ciutadella, destroyed it, slaughtered the inhabitants, and carried off 3,000 survivors to Istanbul as slaves. In 1563, Turgut Reis landed at the shores of the province of Granada, Spain, and captured the coastal settlements in the area like Almuñécar, along with 4,000 prisoners. Barbary pirates frequently attacked the Balearic Islands, resulting in many coastal watchtowers and fortified churches being erected. The threat was so severe that Formentera became uninhabited. Early modern sources are full of descriptions of the sufferings of Christian galley slaves of the Barbary corsairs. Those who have not seen a galley at sea, especially in chasing or being chased, cannot well conceive the shock such a spectacle must give to a heart capable of the least tincture of commiseration. To behold ranks and files of half-naked, half-starved, half-tanned, meager wretches chained to a plank, from whence they remove not for months together, commonly half a year, urged on even beyond human strength, with cruel and repeated blows on their bare flesh. As late as 1798, the islet near Sardinia was attacked by the Tunisians, and over 900 inhabitants were taken away as slaves. Sahrawi Moorish society in northwest Africa was traditionally, and still is to some extent, stratified into several tribal castes, with the Hussein warrior tribes ruling and extracting tribute, Horma, from the subservient Berber-descended Znaga tribes. Below them ranked servile groups known as Haratin, a black population. Enslaved sub-Saharan Africans were also transported across North Africa into Arabia to do agricultural work because of their resistance to malaria that plagued Arabia and North Africa at the time of early enslavement. Sub-Saharan Africans were able to endure the malaria-infested lands they were transported to, which is why North Africans were not transported despite their close proximity to Arabia and its surrounding lands. Horn of Africa. In the Horn of Africa, the Christian kings of the Ethiopian Empire captured slaves primarily from the pagan Nilotic Shankela and Oromo peoples from their western borderlands, or from newly conquered or reconquered lowland territories. The Somali and Afar Muslim sultanates, such as the medieval Adal Sultanate, through their ports also traded Zanj, Bantu slaves captured from the hinterland. Slavery, as practiced in Ethiopia, was essentially domestic and was geared more towards women. This was the trend for most of Africa as well. Women were transported across the Sahara, the Middle East, the Mediterranean, and the Indian Ocean trade more than men. Enslaved people served in the houses of their masters or mistresses and were not employed to any significant extent for productive purposes. The enslaved were regarded as second-class members of their owner's family. The first attempt to abolish slavery in Ethiopia was made by Emperor Tewodros II, r. 1855-68. although the slave trade was not legally abolished until 1923 when Ethiopia ascended to the League of Nations. Anti-slavery society estimated there were 2 million slaves in the early 1930s, out of an estimated population of between 8 and 16 million. Slavery continued in Ethiopia until the Italian invasion in October 1935, when the institution was abolished by order of the Italian occupying forces. In response to pressure by Western allies of World War II, Ethiopia officially abolished slavery and involuntary servitude after it regained its independence in 1942. On 26 August 1942, Haile Selassie issued a proclamation outlawing slavery. In Somali territories, slaves were purchased in the slave market exclusively to do work on plantations. In terms of legal considerations, the customs regarding the treatment of Bantu slaves were established by the decree of sultans and local administrative delegates. These plantation slaves often acquired their freedom through eventual emancipation, escape, and ransom. Slavery in Ethiopia existed for centuries, going as far back as 1495 BC and ending in 1942. There are also sources indicating the export of slaves from the Aksumite Empire, 10940 AD. The practice formed an integral part of Ethiopian society. Slaves were traditionally drawn from the Nilotic groups locally known as Shankela, as well as Oromos. War captives were another source of slaves, though the perception, treatment, and duties of these prisoners was markedly different. Religious law banned Christian slave masters from taking Christians as slaves. However, many Muslim Ethiopian slave traders took part in the Arab slave trade. In what is now Ethiopia, the Abyssinian Church justified slavery with its version of the Curse of Ham, a belief possibly adopted from medieval Jewish and Muslim scholars, which would later find its way to the Western world. The abolition of slavery became a high priority for the Haile Selassie regime, which began in 1930. International pressures forced action, and it was required for membership in the League of Nations. During Italian occupation, the temporary government issued 2 laws in October 1935 and in April 1936, which abolished slavery and freed 420,000 Ethiopian slaves. After the Italians were expelled, Emperor Haile Selassie returned to power and officially abolished slavery and involuntary servitude by making it a law on 26 August 1942. Ethiopia later ratified the 1926 Slavery Convention in 1969. Following the abolition of slavery in the 1940s, freed slaves were typically employed as unskilled labor by their former masters. Slavery in Somalia existed as a part of the East African slave trade and Arab slave trade. To meet the demand for menial labor, Bantus from southeastern Africa slaves were exported from Zanzibar and were sold in cumulatively large numbers over the centuries to customers in East Africa and other areas in Northeast Africa and Asia by the Somalis. Ethiopians, especially Amharas and Tigrayans, were also captured and sold to traders from Arabia, India, Greece, and beyond. The trade routes of slaves in medieval Africa. Oromo subjects were favored due to their features compared to other slaves. Additionally, they were not viewed as very different from their Somali owners, thus being higher in price compared to other East Africans. Habesha slave trade. Habesha slaves were sold by Somalis as early as the 13th century. Archival records compiled at the end of Rasulid Sultan al-Muzaffar Yusuf's rule in the 1290s mentions that the main slaves brought to Yemen were of Amhara and Tigrayan ethnic backgrounds and were shipped from the port city of Zayla. A eunuch of Amhara origin would cost 4 dinars, while a concubine would cost 2 dinars. The Adalite Sultan Jamal ad-Din sold numerous Amharas into slavery in places as far away as Greece and India. By the end of each of his battles, he would distribute 3 Amhara slaves to the poorest Muslims and sell the rest of them for a cheap sum due to their overwhelming number.